Not everything that breaks you is meant to destroy you. I'm Christy. Welcome to the unraveling.
Hi, beautiful soul. Welcome back to Sacred Union Within. I'm Christy, and before we begin, I simply want to say thank you. Whether you've been here from the beginning or this is your very first visit, I'm truly grateful you've chosen to spend a little of your day here with me. Today's video is one I have wanted to revisit for quite some time. When I first spoke about Kundalini awakening, this channel was still finding its voice, and so was I. Looking back, I have learned so much, not only through my own experiences, my intimate friends' experiences, but also through the stories so many of you have generously shared in the comments over the year. Again and again, I've been reminded that while every spiritual journey is unique, there are certain experiences that many of us seem to share. So if you found this video because something unusual has been happening to you, perhaps you've been experiencing intense emotions, vivid dreams, strange sensations moving through your body, or a deep feeling that your life is changing in ways you can't quite explain, I hope today's conversation brings you a little comfort. Before we begin, I want to tell you something that may surprise you. I didn't know I was experiencing a Kundalini awakening. If you have watched my backstory, you've already heard pieces of this journey. At the time, I called them multiple dark nights of the soul. I spoke about overwhelming grief, heart chakra activation, and the twin flame connection that completely changed my life. It wasn't until years later that I looked back and realized those experiences weren't separate chapters. They were all part of the same awakening. Not everyone experiences Kundalini the same way. Some people experience very little physically, while others notice emotional, energetic, or spiritual changes. Some people don't resonate with the term Kundalini at all, and that's okay. So today I'm simply sharing my experience. Not because it is the only way, but because when I was living through it, I would have given anything to hear someone say, I know what this feels like. For me, everything began after a twin flame connection that completely unraveled my world. What I thought was heartbreak became the catalyst for something far greater than I could ever have imagined. I thought I was losing someone else, but looking back, I realized I was also losing the version of myself that could no longer continue unchanged. So today, I don't want to give you a checklist. I want to tell you what it actually felt like. Because sometimes experiences speak louder than definitions. One of the first things I noticed was tears. Now, looking back, I think this was one of the very first signs that something profound was happening inside of me. At the time, I didn't know it was Kundalini. I didn't know my heart was beginning to awaken. I just knew I could not stop crying. Not all day, not every day, but completely out of nowhere. I would be having a perfectly normal day. I would be at work, driving to work, making dinner, folding laundry, watching a movie, and then a song would come on. Sometimes it was nothing more than the sound of a violin, and suddenly I would be sobbing. Not just a few tears, it would be the kind of crying that seems to come from somewhere so deep inside that you didn't even know it existed. It didn't even sound human half the time. And nothing happened. No one had upset me. There wasn't always a memory attached to it. It was as though something ancient had finally found its way to the surface. And at that time, I thought I was falling apart. And looking back, I think I was finally allowing myself to feel everything my heart had been carrying for years. And because my awakening was deeply intertwined with the twin flame journey, I often wondered if I was only grieving him. Now, with the gift of hindsight, I see something very different. Yes, I was grieving the connection, but I was also grieving old versions of myself, old wounds, old fears, old stories. The twin flame connection didn't create those things. For me, it simply illuminated them. It was as though someone had opened the door to a room inside of my heart that had been locked for decades. And once that door opened, it wasn't going to close again. As painful as those tears were, I no longer see them as weakness. I see them as one of the first ways my soul began teaching me that healing isn't always gentle. Sometimes, sometimes it arrives one tear at a time. Then something happened that I still struggle to put into words. If the tears were the most painful part of my awakening, this was without question the most beautiful. It didn't happen every day, and it would come in waves, completely unexpected. I would be quietly sitting with a cup of my coffee, driving in my car, walking outside, or simply sitting in meditation, and all of a sudden, it felt as though my heart was expanding. Not emotionally or physically. It it is difficult to explain unless you've experienced it yourself. There was this incredible warmth in the center of my chest, almost as my heart had become too big for my body. And then the feeling would spread, wave after wave of love would ripple through me. It was a romantic love, not an excitement of falling in love with another person. This was something entirely different. It was bliss, pure, overwhelming bliss. The kind that made me smile through tears because I had never felt anything like it before. There were moments where I felt so connected to life that I honestly couldn't tell where I ended and everything else began. I would look at the trees and feel connected to them, the sky, the birds, the people walking past me. I even remember laughing at myself one day because I felt connected to my couch, to the chairs in my house, to everything. And I know this sounds completely ridiculous when I say it out loud, but that's exactly how it felt. It was as though every illusion of separation had disappeared for just a few precious moments. I was one with with it all. Now, because my awakening unfolded through the twin flame journey, I can't separate those experiences from the catalyst that opened my heart. The heartbreak cracked me open, but what poured through those cracks wasn't just grief, it was love. Not love for one person, but love for everything, everyone, love for it all. And looking back, I realized that the heart doesn't only break open to release pain. Sometimes it breaks open so you can finally remember what unconditional love feels like. Those moments didn't erase the difficult days, far from it, but they gave me hope. They reminded me that there was something extraordinary happening beneath all of the confusion. And even now, when I think back on those moments, I don't remember the fear first. I remember the love. And I will be grateful for that feeling for the rest of my life. And then the world around me changed, as if everything I'd experienced so far wasn't enough. I began noticing subtle changes in the way I experienced the world itself. At first, I thought I was imagining it. The colors seemed brighter, not just brighter, almost as though someone had turned the saturation all the way up. The sky was bluer, the grass looked greener, the flowers seemed almost impossibly vibrant. I remember walking outside and thinking, has the world always looked like this? Even the air felt different. It felt crisp, fresh, alive. I found myself slowing down just to notice things I had rushed past my entire life. The sound of birds in the morning, the way sunlight filtered through the trees, the smell of the rain, the warmth of the sun on my skin. Life itself felt more alive. And then there was the food. Oh, let's talk about the food. I still laugh when I think about it. I became absolutely obsessed with fruit. Yes, fruit. Pineapple, mangoes, peaches, bananas, oranges. I couldn't get enough. I used to joke that every smoothie bowl was like a party in my mouth. Fresh salads tasted unbelievably crisp. Simple food suddenly felt vibrant and nourishing in the way I'd never experienced before. And for about a year, I naturally gravitated toward raw vegan lifestyle. Not because someone told me to, and not because I thought I should. My body simply seemed to know what it wanted. Looking back, I don't think my taste buds changed. I think my awareness did. It was as though all of my senses had been turned way up. Colors were richer, music reached deeper, food tasted fuller. Nature became my sanctuary. And because this awakening had been ignited through my twin flame journey, I often found myself wondering if my heart had become so open that it was no longer just perceiving life. It was experiencing it more fully. I don't know if that's the perfect explanation though, but that's the closest I've ever come to describing it. It is one of the reasons I always encourage people to spend time in nature during periods of awakening. When everything inside you feels unfamiliar, nature has a beautiful way of reminding you that transformation is one of the life's most natural processes. Trees don't resist the changing seasons. Flowers don't question when it's time to bloom. Perhaps we aren't meant to resist our own unfolding either. My body began speaking a language I didn't understand. As my awakening continued, I noticed something else. It wasn't just my emotions that were changing, my body was changing too. There were moments where an incredible warmth would suddenly move through me, not because the room was hot or a hot flash. I am of the age right now. And not because I had fever. I felt like waves of heat rising from somewhere deep within. Sometimes they would move through my chest, other times through my entire body. There were days when the palms of my hands would become incredibly warm, the soles of my feet too. Sometimes they would vibrate, other times I felt as though every cell in my body was quietly humming with energy. My face vibrated. It was so weird. I remember placing my hands on my chest and thinking, what is happening to me? And if I'm being completely honest, there were moments that frightened me because I had absolutely no framework for what I was experiencing. There were times when the energy felt so intense that all I could do was lie still and let it move through me. It almost felt as though my body was doing something without asking my permission. Not in a frightening way, but in a way that reminded me I wasn't in control of the process. And looking back, one of the images that comes to mind is a forest after a wildfire. From the outside, it looks like everything has been destroyed, but beneath the surface, new life is already preparing to emerge. That's the closest comparison I can make. And there were moments where it felt as though the old version of me was being burned away. It didn't feel like it was a punishment, and it didn't feel like I had done something wrong. But it felt like something within me was making space for who I was becoming. Again, I didn't understand any of this at the time. I wasn't reading about Kundalini or wasn't watching any videos about it, trying to match my experiences. I was simply living them. And because this all unfolded through my twin flame journey, I often wondered if I was somehow feeling both of my own transformation and the intensity of a connection I couldn't explain. I don't pretend to have all the answers. I don't. And I can only tell you what I have experienced. What I do know is this: my body became one of my greatest teachers. It taught me when to slow down, when to rest, when to breathe, when to stop fighting what was unfolding. And perhaps that's one of the greatest lessons this journey gave me. Sometimes healing isn't something we do. Sometimes it is something we learn to surrender to. This twin flame journey has changed the way I understand intuition. There is one part of my awakening that I don't often talk about, not because I'm ashamed of it, but because it's one of the hardest things to put into words. Long before I had ever heard the term twin flame, something unusual was already happening. It didn't begin with dramatic visions or extraordinary spiritual experiences. It began with quiet little moments that on their own didn't seem like much. I'd suddenly think of him for no apparent reason, open Facebook, and there he was. Sometimes I'd post a photo, and before I even looked at my phone, something inside me would say, he has seen it. And I check, and he just liked it seconds before. There were moments where I could almost feel when his attention has shifted towards me. Moments where I sensed he was thinking about me. At first, I dismissed it. I told myself it was coincidence, that I was imagining things. But after years of these little experiences repeating themselves, I found myself paying closer attention. Not because I wanted to prove anything, but because my own body kept whispering, pay attention. It was teaching me to trust something deeper than my logical mind. And then, after the ghosting, everything intensified. Even though we weren't speaking, the connection never seemed to disappear. In fact, there were days it felt even stronger. I remember pleading with God over and over again, on every day. Please, please take him out of my system or just take me. Because I couldn't understand why someone I hadn't seen in decades could still feel so profoundly present in my life. I wasn't trying to hold on to him. If anything, I was desperately trying to let him go. And yet, something inside me wouldn't let go. Now, looking back now, I don't believe the journey was asking me to become attached to another person. I believe it was asking me to become deeply honest with myself. The connection became the catalyst. It cracked open my heart. It challenged everything I believed. It invited me to trust my intuition in ways I had never trusted it before. And it ultimately led me back to myself. It wasn't until 2 years later, during a quiet meditation, that I heard two words repeating over and over in my mind: twin flame. Again, twin flame, twin flame. I remember opening my eyes and thinking, what on earth is twin flame? I never searched the term, I'd never read a book about it. I had no idea what it meant. But that moment became the beginning of another chapter. Not because I suddenly had all the answers, but because I finally had the place to begin asking better questions. Whether you resonate with the idea of twin flames or not, my invitation is always the same. Don't build your journey around a label. Build it around your healing. Because no matter what the name we give the experience, its greatest purpose is to bring us back home to ourselves. There were also moments I could never quite explain. As my awakening continued, there were experiences that became even harder to describe. Meditation slowly became my refuge. It was the one place where my mind became quiet enough for my heart to breathe. Some days I would simply sit in the silence. Other days I would experience things that completely challenged my understanding of reality. There were moments where my body felt incredibly light, almost as though I was floating. I remember opening my eyes more than once just to reassure myself I was still sitting exactly where I started. There were visions too. Not every meditation, not every day, but enough that I began paying attention. Sometimes they came as symbols, sometimes as colors, sometimes as shapes, sometimes as a deep inner knowing that arrived without words. And perhaps that's the strangest part of all, the knowing. It's difficult to explain to someone who hasn't experienced it. It wasn't guessing, it wasn't overthinking, it wasn't anxiety, it was simply knowing. Quiet, gentle, and certain. Not because I could prove it, but because something deep within me recognized it. That inner knowing became one of my greatest teachers. Not because it made life easier, but because it slowly taught me to trust myself again. It taught me that wisdom doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers. And if we become quiet enough, we hear it. Years later, when I finally heard the words twin flame during meditation, I didn't feel dramatic. It felt familiar, almost as though I wasn't learning something new. I was remembering something I had forgotten. Now, whether that moment was spiritual, intuitive, or simply my subconscious finally connecting the dots, I can't say with certainty. What I can say is that it marked the beginning of understanding my journey in a completely different way. And for that, I will always be grateful. Before we finish, today's video focused on the beautiful side of Kundalini awakening, the moments of love, the heart expansion, the heightened senses, the feeling of becoming more alive. But if I'm being completely honest with you, that wasn't the whole story. There was another side of this journey, one that I don't think gets talked about nearly enough. The moments I spent screaming into my pillow because the emotional pain felt unbearable. The baths where I cried until there were no tears left, only to dry my face, walk out, and pretend everything was okay. The days I genuinely questioned my own sanity, because I couldn't understand what was happening to me. The fear, the loneliness, the exhaustion, the feeling that my entire identity was crumbling beneath my feet. And for a long time, I kept those parts of my story to myself. But I don't think we serve one another by only talking about the bliss. We also need to talk about the breaking, because for many of us, that is where the awakening truly begins. So, my friends, next Monday, if you feel called, I would love for you to join me. I'm going to share the darker side of my Kundalini awakening, not to create fear, but to offer hope. Because if you're walking through that part of the journey right now, I want you to know that someone else has been there too, and that there is light on the other side. Thank you for spending this time with me. And until next time, dear soul, please take care of your heart, trust your journey, and keep returning to your sacred union within. I love you all, and I will talk to you very soon. Bye now.
You're not here by accident. Your soul knew. We'll meet again right here between the lines.